Welcome, everybody. This is Melinda Stewart from HL7. Our session today is using an identity broker to augmenting existing login solution to be Smart on FHIR compatible. Our speaker today is Joshua Varner from Lineate. Joshua, take it away.
Thank you. I'm unmuted. So who am I? Joshua Varner. I'm a software architect at Lineate. They wanted us to have a picture, so that's me. When it comes to the scope of what I'm talking about, it's authentication, authorization. They're complicated, so I'm not going to cover those topics in general. I'm mainly going to concentrate on the discovery and requirements process for how you need to approach a project like this and the questions you need to ask. And there'll be some of the high-level technical design. It's light on details, and a lot of those details are really just kind of nitpicky and tedious, and we only have about 20 minutes. So going into a lot of that technical detail is not easy. So the project that I'm talking about started off kind of simple. They, as a government entity, they wanted to provide a Smart on FHIR compatible API with just initially one client application. It's pretty straightforward. They needed to ingest data from some existing systems, populate that repository, and set up a daily job to make sure they keep it up to date. Again, that's fairly simple. But then they wanted to leverage their existing login service, which is owned by another department and shared across multiple departments without making any changes to it. And that's where it started to get a little bit more complicated, because that eliminates a lot of the off-the-shelf options. You can do identity providers with a number of repositories, but there's a limit to how much customization you can do there. But the basic idea of linking to an existing identity, an existing provider, I mean, these organizations, all organizations invest heavily into their identity management solutions. This is a government entity. There's supporting policies and procedures they run outside of their online systems to verify people's identity, and they're doing a lot of things, and corporate customers are the same. There's lots of policies and procedures around the identities, managing those policies, only wanting to manage that stuff in one place. So this is a problem that we're expecting to start seeing more and more. And luckily, there's a standard solution to this part of the problem, and that's that identity broker provider option. One of the major benefits is having that broker authorization server brings the control of that authorization server back into the system that is managing the repository. Since in Smart on FHIR, that authorization server really does have to be pretty highly coupled with your FHIR repository. So having them separated, it's the authentication versus authorization piece lets you separate those aspects as well. But in terms of dealing with multiple departments and cross-team communication, it makes it easier to bring that into a separate piece that you can manage easier. So adding the Smart on FHIR semantics to the brokered identity, authorization, again, it's complex. No one wants to write a new authorization server. That's not fun. So we're leveraging existing technology. We chose Keycloak as our authorization server, and there's a set of Keycloak extensions that we're leveraging to provide the basic Smart on FHIR pieces. And getting those set up gets us a good chunk of that way. But then you start getting into the actual mapping of the identities. And that's where you start to get into the much more specific parts where you really need to talk to what the specifics of this particular integration. So in particular, the FHIR user scope contains the URL of the resource that represents that set of credentials, the patient, practitioner, related person, those get into the weirder corner cases, but typically patient or practitioner. since that's showing up as a scope in your authorization, that means that authorization, that repository have to be able to know a lot of detail about each other. So the biggest part of that is if you've got an existing identity platform that they're not going to make Smart on FHIR compatible, you've got to figure out how are you going to map from that into your repository. And especially in this environment, they didn't want to make any changes there. So for our particular use case, where the ID token is going to contain a scope with a medical identifier that's available that we're going to be able to request. And from an implementation perspective, we're putting together a custom extension for Keycloak that will retrieve that identifier scope value, perform a lookup on the repository, and then populate that FHIR user scope. So, and the reason we kind of have to do it there, all of this has to happen in the context of the login itself. So before you even have a fully authorized person, you have to do this lookup. So the lookup itself is happening with a Lambda that's being invoked to do the query. One of the requirements that this particular group wanted was they didn't want us to cache those credentials or cache that lookup, so that if they do something to resolve identity conflicts or patient unification, something like that, they wanted the repository to stay the source of truth. So we needed to go ahead and do that lookup essentially on every login. I feel like I'm moving really fast. Gotcha. This. Okay, so with this group, if you don't have a resource that represents that set of credentials and you do the lookup, what can you do? You can't provide someone a FHIR user scope that doesn't point anywhere. That's not valid. So ingestions, it's driven by the exporting system. It's completely independent from the identity provider. So there's a good chance, and we know in our particular case, it's a guarantee that there's going to be identities that exist in that identity provider that are not present in our imports, because we're importing only certain types of records and we're only importing the patients that have undergone those particular procedures, which means we know there are going to be people that haven't had those procedures done that are going to try to log into our system. And there are use cases where we need to be able to let those people log in and find out that they have effectively no records to see. But what that means is we need to introduce a secondary import workflow. So we have the main ingestion process that's going to bring over the majority of our data, but now we need to have something that lets the patient look up on failure. It needs to be able to reach out, get demographics, so it can create a patient resource, put it in the repository, and then go ahead and let the authentication finish. And luckily, this only needs to happen the one time on basically their first login. From that point on, that patient resource will be staged for them. But even more than kind of exploring the mapping piece and whether or not you're going to have the same set of patients, this is a patient-facing application where they're not only able to see their information, but they need to be able to see the dependents information. So again, their existing identity solution, they don't have any of those relationships saved somewhere. They have information that lets you verify access to particular accounts. So the information associated with a child has a phone number associated with it. So they can run a process that validates access to that phone number, and that for them allows them to say they are comfortable saying, if you have access to the phone number, then you're authorized to see the records for that individual. But you then need to store those relationships somewhere, which there's kind of three options. Clearly, the one that I don't list is if the identity solution has that information, you can query it there. If the application stores them, then it has to access the repository with system level credentials. Because if the application says, I have access to this set of records, and it's the one that knows that, there's no way for the repository to validate that access. We can log it, we can audit it, but we can't say, yes, you have access to this. So that pretty much relegates the relationship to kind of a system level access. And that's not something they were comfortable with. So we had to figure out a way for having the repository store them. So to do that, we needed to set up a secondary kind of API that lets the verification process, which involves user interaction, clearly, it needs to be able to, once it's made the decision that these two people have access to each other's data, they need to make a call in to let the repository know they can save that. So the way we're doing that is we're storing consent records. So after they verified, a parent's verified access to a child, for example, we'll get a call on this API, we'll create a consent record saying the parent has access to the child patient's records. And then we can let that drive access from when the parent does a query, they can get the set of patients that they see. Which I talked through a lot of this already. And again, here we have the same kind of missing patient functionality that they may not be there again. So our dependent API really has to, it leverages that same patient lookup so it can get access to the patient demographics data, because if we don't persist those records, then someone would need to log in and verify that they have access to someone's data, do a lookup, they don't find anything. If we don't save that consent record, which requires the patients, then the next time they log in to see, they're going to have to go through that entire verification process again, which is not an experience that they wanted to have. So we go ahead and we needed to leverage that same kind of auto generation capability. So if you have questions, you can contact me through the Hoover app or email directly. And I guess I kind of went through. And part of the reason I wanted to, I guess, talk about in terms of why the scope is mainly about the discovery process is a lot of these things were things we discovered going down the line through multiple conversations. So getting to where you know the types of questions to ask early lets you front load a lot of those questions. Like, for example, the latest one that came up is I made the assumption that the lookups on those IDs were only ever going to return a single patient. And we just found out that we can, in fact, actually get multiple patients on that ID that's coming back. So now we're looking at, okay, what process do we need to have in place to handle that? So from our perspective, from the API's perspective, we're not going to let them in, because we don't have a way, if that ID doesn't return a single patient, we don't have access to information to resolve that. There's a first name and a last name that you can get from the identity solution, but there's no guarantee that those match their medical records. So unfortunately, at least initially, we're just going to have to give them an error and some contact information that says you need to contact this agency and try to resolve what's going on. And we can fire an alert internally to say, hey, this patient is, this lookup is having problems, and here's some information, maybe they can resolve it on their side. So anyway, questions?
Joshua, we do have 2 questions in Whova.
Yes.
You want to read those or want me to read them to you?
I'm reading. So no, we didn't look at, I didn't consider using the person resource to do the login user mapping, mainly because they were all patients. So there were already going to be patient records for all of them. Because anyone who logged in who didn't have a patient record yet, all they had to do was go in and get a fairly common procedure, and then they would have a patient record. So reconciling the person and the patient later would be more complicated than just going ahead and hydrating a patient and putting it there. We still have to do a little bit of mapping in terms of the ingestion, but it's a lot easier with the single resource. We are a little bit, yeah. So would you be concerned with the revocation latency of the sync pipeline to the FHIR repository? So when it comes to the latency of these logins, yes, there is some concern, especially since we're having to reach out to a couple of different systems. The initial just patient lookup, that's the one that's the most common, that's going to happen. We're comfortable saying that's going to be really fast because that authorization server and the repository are hosted together, so their responsive, their latency should be really, really low. The latency to the external identity provider, for the most part, involves a person, because they're going to get redirected. They're going to have to enter their username and password, then they'll get redirected back. So that part involves a person. So it's, yeah, there's some latency questions there, but since the person's in the middle of it, they're probably going to be a non-issue. The other thing is most of this functionality is it's first access. So if they fall into any of those created patterns, or if they're doing the dependent linking, those are all kind of one-time things. So yeah, we are concerned about latency there, but the patient resources only need to be hydrated once, and then from that point on, it's into the standard fairly fast use case. The dependents only need to be hydrated once, and we don't expect there to be the lookups related to the consent records should be fairly quick, because there may be an aggregate many consent records, but we're not going to see someone who has access to hundreds and hundreds of people's data.
That's all I see in Whova, but we do have 2 more minutes left. If someone has a question, either in the room there or online, you're welcome to unmute yourself if you're online, or raise your hand. Michael, I don't know if you see anyone in the room that has questions.
I do. There's one here.
Oh, excellent.
So thanks, Josh. I always knew Smart on FHIR was just as easy as you've described it. I think I'm in product, so I'm not someone who's actively doing these things. I try to learn them and demonstrate them and show people in my company how to do these things, at least the ones that use our specific product. So the thing that I guess I always sort of either was mystified by or thought I understood at various places was like that relationship between somebody's login and identity and what the ID is inside of any particular FHIR repository that they may be accessing through that identity. And I guess my initial thought was, well, Smart on FHIR just does all that, or that there's something in the FHIR repository that will hold all that. So when you're doing that lookup service initially, I think you said that was a Lambda function. Mm-hmm. Where is that actual, say, mapping table? Where is that persisted? The thing that says, hey, Bob H is actually patient ID, crazy GUID.
The patient resources that are being loaded and created will have a patient identifier that's that particular system. And so that's the lookup we're doing on, is we're actually querying the patient resources to do that. So we're in effect querying for that, like part of the login process queries for the particular patient to set that FHIR user scope to then let them potentially query for that patient again. So yeah, there's definitely some inefficiency there. But yeah, one of the reasons why it feels like it just kind of should work with Smart on FHIR is Smart on FHIR also grew up in kind of that EHR context where the authorization server and the repository were both the EHR, and there was an app in the middle of it. So that linkage was kind of just there naturally since they were both provided by the same system. And so it definitely feels more natural that way. And
so the actual, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, so there isn't like an actual table that says, hey, Bob is this patient in this repository and he's this patient in that repository.
No.
You're always going back to the FHIR repository and doing some kind of search based on what you know about the person logging in. Is that
in this particular environment? Yes, because
okay.
they don't. If we introduce caching, then we introduce the potential for that cache to be invalid.
Yeah, that's what you meant by caching. I get you.
And again, you can't really have a single authorization server valid for, I mean, I guess you can, but a single Smart on FHIR set of credentials isn't going to be valid for multiple repositories.
Exactly.
Unless all of those repositories are synced in such a way that the patient URL is going to be the same across all of them. And I guess one thing I kind of forgot to mention is, like, if you're in a corporate context and you're dealing with a physician facing application, you've got the option to do a much more comprehensive ingestion process where I imagine you'd actually want to just go ahead and populate all of your practitioner resources in advance. So there are definitely contexts where you're not going to have the potential for missing resources. At least it's much lower frequency kind of probability. This just happens to be one where they don't feel comfortable importing the entire set of of identities that are in their identity provider.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's got to be ongoing maintenance anyway. So I love the hydration approach there. That's